Okay, we're trying to factor a binomial. A binomial is an expression that has how many terms? 2 terms. We're factoring this by finding the greatest common factor. What does it mean to factor? What were we doing the whole time when we were factoring? You're looking for 2 things that multiply together to get you back to the answer, right? Factoring is the opposite of expanding. Remember we were looking for common factors before. We did common factors of 6, where 1 times 6, 2 times 3. To factor means that you're finding 2 things that you multiply together to get back to the answer. Okay? So to factor this question, I'm looking for 2 things that I have to multiply together to get 10x minus 15. So we have to figure out, first we have to find the greatest common factor. Okay, so find the greatest common factor of 10 and 15. 10 and 15. 1 times what gives me 10? 2 times what? Any other factors for 10? No. What about 15? 1 times 2, 3, and 5, 4. Done. So we are trying to factor this. So if we know that the greatest common factor is what? What's the greatest common factor? 5. Do they both have a variable in common? No. So what you're telling me is that both of these terms are divisible by 5. Is that correct? So 5 goes into 10x how many times? What's 10x divided by 5? 2x. What's 15 divided by 5? Sorry, negative 15 divided by 5 is negative 3. Okay, so what we're doing is we're saying that 5 times 2x minus 3 is equal to 10x minus 15. Is that true? If you are finding the greatest common factor, you are dividing everything by that greatest common factor. The opposite of division is multiplication. What that means is that if I can divide it by 5, then whatever the answer is, if I multiply it back by 5, I'm going to get back to the original question. That's all you're doing. Find the greatest common factor, divide each term by that common factor to figure out what it is in factored form. This right here is factored form. You've factored it because you figured out the 2 things that you multiply together. So I multiply 5 times 2x minus 3 to get back to the original question. That's what you're doing when you factor. So these are the steps to factoring by using the greatest common factor. Step 1. Step 1. Find the greatest common factor. So let's do example A. What is the greatest common factor of 4x and 24? What number are both of these divisible by? The highest number we can divide both those terms by? 4. That's step 1. Find the greatest common factor. Now what? Once you find the greatest common factor, what do you do with that number? Can you read it? Jeno? Number 2. Divide each term by your greatest common factor. So this is step 2. Look here. I found the greatest common factor. Now I'm going to take that. I'm going to divide each term by the greatest common factor. So if I can divide something by 4, it means I can multiply it by 4. Multiply something by 4 to get back to the answer. So now we're going to step 3. Write the expression in factored form. So you always put the greatest common factor in front, right here, and then whatever your answer is when you divide. So if I do 4x divided by 4, what's 4x divided by 4? 1x. So this is your divided polynomial. What's negative 24 divided by 4? Negative divided by positive is negative 6. That's it. That's factored form. I can check now. Check your answer by expanding it. Is it true that 4 times 1x minus 6 is equal to the original question, 4x minus 24? Is that true? What's 4 times x? What's 4 times negative 6? So I've checked. I got the same thing as my original question, so I know I did it right. This is factored form right here. You factored it. Okay, this is your answer. 4 bracket x minus 6. Okay, try B right now on your own. Follow the steps. Greatest common factor, they're both divisible by 2. And remember, when it has a variable, you look for the one that has the lowest exponent. So it would just be n. So that means both of these can be divided by 2n. If it can be divided by 2n, it can be multiplied by 2n. So simplify it. Solve it. What's 6n squared divided by 2n? What's 6 divided by 2? What's n squared divided by n? N. What's positive 10 divided by 2n? Sorry, positive 10n divided by 2n is 5. How can I check to make sure that's right? What's 2n times 3n? 6n squared. What's 2n times 5? 10n. Was that the original question? Yes, so this is correct. So this is factored form. We're going to skip this one. Okay, what if you have 3 terms? This one's a little harder because you're trying to find the greatest common factor of 3x squared, 12x, and 18. Is your greatest common factor going to have a variable in common?
Yes.
No. This term has an x, this term has an x, and this one does not have an x. So your greatest common factor cannot have an x in it. All 3 of those cannot be divided by x. So it's just going to be a number. What are all 3 of these terms divisible by? What's the largest number I can divide all 3 of them by? 3. Right? I can divide this by 3, I can divide this by 3, and I can divide this by 3. Right? So, how do I write it in factored form? Put the greatest common factor in front and divide and get your answer. What's 3x squared divided by 3? Just x squared. Look here. What's negative 12x divided by 3? What's a negative divided by a positive? What's 12 divided by 3? 4x. Then, what's positive 18 divided by 3? Positive. That's it. That's your answer. We're done. Try this one on your own. 4x squared minus 6x plus 8. Step 1, find the greatest common. All of these are divisible by 2. They're not all divisible by x. This is divisible by 2, 2, and 2. I can't divide it by x because if I divided this by x, I can't. There's no x here. Okay? So, how do I write it in factored form? What goes in front? 2. And then do the opposite. 2x squared. Negative 6x divided by 2 is negative 3x. 8 divided by 2. That's it. Okay, so if I give you a rectangle, and I tell you that the area of the rectangle is represented by 12x squared plus 20x, we're trying to figure out what is the length and what is the width. So you're trying to figure out 2 things that you multiply together to get back to the answer. What do you have to do? Factoring gives you 2 things you multiply together to get to the original answer, right? So if my area is 12x squared plus 20x, I'm trying to figure out what is the greatest common factor, because if I divide it by that, I'm going to get 2 things that I multiply together to get back to the original question. So what is the greatest common factor? They're both divisible by 4, and do they have a variable in common? X. So this can be divided by 4x, and this can be divided by 4x, which means that if I multiply 4x times something, it gets me back to the question. So what is 12x squared divided by 4x? It'd just be 3x, because x times x is x squared, right? And then positive 20x divided by 4x equals positive Just 5. The x divided by x cancels out. Reduces to 1. Okay, what's the length of this rectangle then? Area of a rectangle is equal to length times width. You just found two things that you multiplied together to get back to the question. So the length would be 4x, and the width would be 3x plus 5. Okay, this is the width. That's it. You will have a question exactly like this on your test.